Cost control, it's important that you have an understanding of cost awareness. And so I'm going to look at cost awareness first, and then move on in the second half of my hour into the actual cost management and control itself. So cost management, cost control, first thing I'd say, it's been around since day one. There's even reference in the Bible to it. I think Jesus gave an analogy to his disciples about the cost of being a disciple. And what he basically said is, if you are planning to build a tower, you sit down and work out what it will cost to see if you have enough money to finish the job. And that's exactly what we're doing now. You know, if you're going to have a house extension at home, you sit down first of all, work out the total cost. Have you got enough to do the full house extension? So if you haven't, you look a bit of a fool, don't you, if you've got half an extension built and then it's left there for the next 10 years. So that's what cost management and cost control is all about. And in your daily lives, you'll be doing it as well. And the analogy I'm going to use to hopefully help you try and remember it is, if you're going to have a night out, you work out your budget, don't you? So you work out, what's the bus fare into town? How much is it going to cost in the pub for my drinks? How much is it going to be to get into the nightclub? How much is it going to be to have a kebab on the way home? And how much for the taxi on the way home? So you work all that out, see if you've got enough. And if you haven't, you've got to start planning your budget differently. What can I do differently? Perhaps I won't have the drinks before I go to the club. Perhaps I won't even go to a club. And it might be that during the course of your journey, you've got the bus into town, you've bought your pub drinks, then you go to the nightclub and find out it's twice as expensive as you anticipated. The price has gone up and nobody had told you. So that means you've gone in there and you've spent that, but you've got a little bit less money left. How are you going to get home? Are you going to walk, or are you going to have the kebab? Okay? So you're planning your costs all the time. And in construction, obviously it's different, but it's not really different. We're doing that all the time in construction. You as architects are designing things, engineers designing things, we're costing it, and there's very, very few jobs that I've been involved in where you can afford what you want, and you've got to make sacrifices somewhere along the line. So that's what we have to do. The client and you as designers can't always afford everything that you want, or the client can't afford it, or you can't have what you want. You've got to take a compromise. Okay, so cost awareness. I think all of us have an awareness of cost. We can all look at things, tangible things, and say, well, that one clearly costs more than that one. So if you're looking at two motor cars, you can have an idea in 9 times out of 10, that one costs more than that. So here's two buildings. I picked the Gherkin because it's quite an iconic building, instantly recognisable, landmark building in London, designed by Foster and Partners, and it was constructed in 2004. So that's the one on the left, and on the right is a project I was involved in that same period called Lakeview Warrington. So if I was to say to you, first of all, it's not a trick question. Very important to say, it's not a trick question. Put your hands up if you think the Gherkin is the one that costs the most. Thank you. Hopefully all of you put your hands up. I'm not going to embarrass you by saying who thinks it's Lakeview Warrington, because it's clearly the Gherkin. But what we have to ask is why. And I always think if you keep asking why, you get to the root cause. And again, I use it in work. I call it the Tom Jones, why, Delilah. So you're asking, why you're late in for work? I missed the bus. Why did you miss the bus? I got up late. Why did you get up late? I went to bed late. Why did you get to bed late? I went out for some drinks. Why do you go out for some drinks? I'm an alcoholic. Okay, so if you keep asking why, you get to the root cause. Okay, so cost awareness. Which one costs the most? Well, yeah, you're right with the Gherkin. Why does the Gherkin cost more money than Lakeview Warrington? And you've never seen them physically. Well, you might have seen the Gherkin, but I'm sure you haven't seen Lakeview Warrington. Have you got any ideas why one might cost more than the other? So the design is one, yes? Okay, different systems in there. And you're right, actually, because I think Lakeview Warrington just has a heating system in and probably some ventilation. The Gherkin is no doubt fully air-conditioned. Okay? Anything else? Something more obvious? Location. Centre of London, outskirts of Warrington. Okay? So that's one of the why is it cost more. Location. Why is location? Why does it cost to build in the centre of London? Well, that's not the construction cost, but it's related to it. But yeah, but I'm thinking more of labour costs are more expensive. Why are labour costs more expensive in London? Cost of living is more expensive in London. Why is cost of living more expensive in London? Well, cost of living is more expensive because land values are higher, and it costs more to buy a house, it costs more to rent a shop, therefore food's more expensive. So you can see the why. Keep asking why, you get to the root cause. Okay, so there's two buildings. You've passed the first test. We all know that one's more than the other. So we picked up location. I think we picked up size. No, I don't think anybody mentioned shape, but the shape of the building has an influence on cost. The gherkin is circular on plan, and it's like a bulbous shape like this. But interestingly, there's only one curved piece of glass, which is actually at the pinnacle. Everything else is faceted. But nevertheless, building a curve is more expensive than building a rectilinear building. The height, I think somebody mentioned, the gherkin is 41 floors high, and Lakeview Warrington is 3 floors high. And also the overall size of the building. I think the gherkin is nearly 50,000 square metres, and Lakeview is 3,500 square metres. So it's bound to cost more if it's so much bigger. Okay, so cost awareness. Who sets the budget, or the latest terminology is the cost limit? That's the terminology that everybody uses now. So the client sets the budget. And who are your clients? It could be an individual, it could be you or I if you're having a home extension built at home. It could be a partnership, so if you're married or have a living partner, it could be the two of you who are the clients. It could be a limited company, so a board of directors, say Tesco's board of directors making the decisions. Or it could be government departments, and councils are ultimately responsible to central government and the electorate. So again, if you're doing work for a local authority, then really, I suppose it's government you're working for. So they're your clients, different types of clients, and why, when, and I don't know why these little circles with the lines through. I think it's just the formatting. But why, when, and how are cost limits set? So why? So I've got there affordability. The affordability might be, that's all I've got. Okay? Or that's all I can get. That's the most mortgage I can get. That's the most I can lend from the financiers. So that may dictate why you've only got so much to build. Profitability. Most commercial buildings are built for profit. So offices, you build an office to get a rental income. So it'd be no good building the gherkin, as an example, in the centre of Warrington, because you wouldn't be able to command those kind of rents in the centre of Warrington. And you wouldn't build Lakeview in the centre of London, because the rental return, because of the land price, you need a massive rental return on that size of building. Okay? Houses, house builders build houses for profit. What they want to do is build them for a certain price, including the land and all the fees and everything else, and sell them for a higher price to make a return. Okay, so that's what profit. Accountability. So that normally relates to government departments, because you could build the best hospital in the world or the best school in the world and spend an enormous amount of money on it, but is that accountable? At what cost are you taking funds away from other buildings or other departments? So that's what accountability is all about. And value. There's lots of complex definitions for value, but basically value is the relationship between quality and price. So value is the relationship between quality and price. Is it worth paying a little bit more to gain if the value exceeds the extra cost involved? Okay, so if you're building a house for sale, is it worth putting a conservatory on the back of it? How much is it going to cost, and will I get an increased sales value? If you don't, then it's not value. Okay? But you might want to do it because you might get a quicker sale. So there's lots of things to think about. Okay, when when does cost control start? It must start as early as possible. The earlier the better, because it's no good designing a building and putting it in for planning if you then find out it's unaffordable anyway, because you've wasted all that time and all that effort and those costs in getting it to planning. So typically within the RIBA plan of work, it's at stage 0, 1 or 2, or here preparation and briefing stage, which is stage 1 and 2. In terms of how do you do it, development appraisal. Now that's basically you add up all of the costs to build. So that's the building cost, the construction cost, the land cost, the professional fees of architects and engineers, and VAT, etc., etc. So all the cost components to actually build something, and you then compare it to the income. So the income is whatever you sell it for or whatever you rent it for, because if you rent it, you'll get a yield. And so it's one minus the other, hopefully will equal a profit. Could equal a loss, but hopefully it'll equal a profit. So that's why you do development appraisal. And cost limits and allowances, again, tend to apply to government departments. Very often, government departments will say, we allow X pounds per pupil if you're going to build a school, or X pounds per bed space if you're going to build a hospital. Okay? So there are certain benchmarks. I mean, they also have cost per square metre. I think the old, a few years ago for schools, it was £1,600 a square metre as an example. Anything more than that, they wanted to know why is it costing more. Okay, so they have their own cost limits and allowances or benchmarks. Okay, in terms of building development costs that we talked about on the previous slide, so as I say there, the land costs, the acquisitions and the fees associated with buying the land, the construction costs themselves, and then fees, professional fees, planning, survey fees, legal fees, financing costs in times of higher interest rate. At the moment, interest rates are very low. If you can get finance, it's great, because it's quite a low cost. But there have been times when finance costs have been 10-15%, so they're a massive chunk of your development cost. And VAT, that's quite complex, because some elements of construction costs and land costs and fees and everything else, they'll be charged VAT at the standard rate of 20% at the moment. Sometimes it's reduced rate at 5%, and sometimes it's zero rated. So again, VAT legislation has a big influence on the overall development cost. It could be up to 20%. But generally, I don't want to go through all those kind of things over the next, whatever I've got left, 45 minutes. But we're going to look mainly at construction costs, because I think that's what you need to be, your awareness should be of. Okay, so factors affecting development costs. And again, in terms of the formatting, there's lots of things here where they've not left a little break, but my original, honestly, it was spelt correctly and wasn't development costs all as one word. So market conditions. Market conditions, they affect all development costs. So land acquisition, they don't make land anymore. You know, it's there, it's supply and demand. And, you know, if there's a massive demand for land, costs will go up for it. If there's no demand, come down. Same as construction, same kind of thing. Fees, again, the same. And financing costs, which we talked about, you know, the financing costs are quite low at the moment, but the availability, very risk averse, a lot of the lenders. So that has a big effect on development costs. Brexit, that's having an effect on development costs, construction costs. I'm not really sure, I'm not qualified to comment on what the end result might be when we decide whether we're staying or going, and labour costs and everything else, because we do rely on a lot of European labour. And a lot of the European labour at the moment is more skilled than our own labour. So it is a major reliance for us. So in terms of construction costs, as I say, that's what we're going to concentrate on most. Factors affecting construction costs are the actual form of procurement itself, the actual way, the way the contract is going to be set up. So traditional is, you know, where you might have a bill of quantities, design team led. You do a bill of quantities, then you get your price. Design and build, where you give it, you might design so far and then pass it all over to a contractor. management contracting, construction management. They're the four main methods of procurement, and within those are different types as well, as single stage, two stage. Within traditional, there's with quantities, without quantities, and so it goes on. So the method of procurement will affect costs, and the reason for that, why, it's because mainly that there's different risks associated with them. So design and build, you're transferring some of the risk to the contractor. With traditional, most of the risk is retained by the employer, and risk equals money. There's a cost to pay for risk. The method of tendering has an effect on costs as well. So it's the final account cost that is important, not your tendered cost. It's what does it cost at the end. So that's what you should be looking at. And with tendering, normally if you're having a competitive tender, you should get a lower cost. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the lowest final cost. If you're negotiating, generally it does cost you a little bit if you're negotiating. The contractor you're negotiating with won't give you his very, very best price. Normally he'll try and keep a little bit more in there for him. But you do get the benefit of buildability advice and a contractor buy-in. So you can see that tendering negotiation, who knows which is the best way of going. All I would say is it depends what your project is, the complexity of it, how quickly you need it delivered. All those things will affect cost, and the choice of procurement or method of tendering will depend on the most important criteria to you. So as an example, if cost wasn't number one, if it must be built very, very quickly by a certain date because the Queen's going to come and open it, then you might choose management contracting because it means you can get on site very, very quickly, and you can be designing elements that don't need the full design now. So if you're doing traditional, you have to design all of it really. If you're doing management contracting, you can design just the early stages, so the foundations and the frame, and the finishes are going to come a lot later. So you can concentrate just in time almost in your design. But that does have a cost associated with it. You don't know the final cost until you get there. Okay, site constraints themselves have an effect on development costs. So the location we already talked about with the Gherkin and Lakeview. So city centre congestion charges and labour rates. You might have demolition on there or site clearance. That will have an effect. Sloping sites have an effect on cost. Ground conditions, foundation types have an effect on cost. And availability of incoming services and the capacity of them. You may end up having to build a substation for your building. And design variables, I won't talk about that at the moment because I'm going to come on to that in a little bit more detail because that is a thing that should interest architects on there. So in terms of risk, I talked very briefly, risk equals money. And I think risk management is very important. It identifies the best way of managing risks associated with delivering whatever you need to deliver. So the way that you should go through risk management is to identify the risks, produce a risk register, then analyse them. What's the probability of that risk and what's the impact? So let's just say we identify one risk as ground obstructions. We then need to analyse that risk or assess the risk. So what's the likelihood of us having ground obstructions? If it's a city centre site, very likely. If it's out in the country, never been built on before, very unlikely. What's the effect of that risk if we do find ground obstructions? It's going to delay us, it's going to cost us. So what you do there, you do a probability and impact analysis, and you normally score them, say, out of 5. So 1 being low, 5 being high. So what's the probability of hitting obstructions in a city centre site? The probability is probably 4.5. And what's the impact? It's going to be quite a big impact, cost and everything else, 4.5 or 5. So you multiply one by the other, and then you have a risk register. So all those risks that have a high number against, they're the ones that you should focus your mind on. So if conversely it was in the middle of the country side, a site never developed before, what's the risk of hitting obstruction? 1, very low. And what's the impact? Well, the impact, if you did hit it, an obstruction would be still the same, 4.5, 5, whatever, but your score there is only 4 or 5, whilst in the city centre it's 20-ish. So you concentrate on the high scores. And then what you need to do is manage the risk. One way of managing the risk is to shrink it. So a way of shrinking the risk is to look at perhaps doing a site investigation report, even a desktop study report. Has anything been built on that city centre site in the past? What's been there? Have there been basements? Okay, you can get that information fairly free just by going to the library. Or you might want to go a little bit deeper in doing some boreholes and soil sampling and all those kind of things, which cost a little bit of money, but you get a better picture of what's there, and that shrinks the risk. It makes the risk less, or gives you more knowledge of the risk. The other one is to accept the risk, which I think can be quite a dangerous thing. Well, might be there, might not be. We'll wait until we get on site and see what happens. Personally, I think that's the wrong way for 99% of risks. You should try and manage them. Distribute the risk or transfer it. So you could transfer it by doing absolutely nothing and going design and build and pass it all over to the contractor. What I would say is if you're transferring or distributing a risk, you should try and aim to distribute it to the person or the partner in the best position to manage that risk. Okay? So if you're going to distribute, the best way to do it is to the person in the best position to manage that risk. Or eliminate it. So we could actually have an enabling package, a groundworks enabling package, dig out all of the foundations before we get our main contractor on site. So that would eliminate, for the next contractor, all of that risk, because he's got a site that's free of obstructions. So cost awareness, cost implications of design variables. I did say I'd come back to this later. So design variables, so if you're designing buildings, you need to be aware that the size of a building, the increase in floor area, usually produces a reduction in the unit cost. Not the overall cost, but the unit cost. So if a bigger building, the cost per square metre normally comes down because it's economics. And the reason why that happens is because costs don't rise proportionately. So a building of 100 square metres would still have one site agent, whilst a building of 1,000 square metres would still have one site agent. So you've got the same cost to both, but proportionally it's lower for the bigger building. The plan shape, has anyone got any idea what the most efficient plan shape is in terms of enclosing wall area to the plan? I've just given it away, haven't I? But it's circular. Okay, so a circular building in terms of wall to floor area is the most efficient. The enclosing wall, there's less wall around a circle of the same area as say a square, there's less enclosure. Okay, and then an L-shaped building, a square or rectilinear building is the next most efficient. Then an L-shaped building starts adding more wall area, doesn't it? And then you get all complex shapes, adds a lot more wall area. Circulation space is a cost implication. So, office buildings, normally you're trying to look to, 15 to 20% of circulation space, because normally you can't let that circulation space. It's of no value, in inverted commas, apart from getting people from one space to the other, so you can't rent it. So things like the lifts and the staircase cores and the toilet cores and the corridors, a lot of developers try and keep that space down, but you've got to be careful. If you keep it too small, it can look claustrophobic, so you've got to get the right balance. Story heights. So, if you had a building with a story height of 3 metres, say an office, that will be less expensive than one with a story height of 5 metres, okay, for the same shape. Total height. The number of floors dictates. If you're building a bungalow, you've got foundations and you've got a roof, and that covers 1 story. If you've got a house, 2-story house, those same foundations, that same roof, are shared between double the floor area. So normally, the higher you go, up to a certain stage, the cheaper it gets, or the less cost per unit area. But once you go over perhaps 4 or 5 stories, you've then got other considerations about lift, maintenance access, wind loading on the buildings, so the framework, so costs then start to go up again. So there's an optimum height of buildings, so the total height does have an effect. Column spacing. So this auditorium here, if you had a couple of columns in the middle, that would have made this building a lot cheaper to build, but obviously it's impractical to have columns in the middle of a space like this. So large span spaces cost more money. Floor loadings. So some floors in buildings have to have a very high loading because they're holding documents or data. If you're designing for those high loadings, again, the floor structure may be deeper, makes the building higher, and that's why it's going to cost more. And there's more structural strength, heavier foundations or more robust foundations. And the general specification itself, which we talked about right at the beginning, didn't we? High quality specification items cost more money. But you should also be looking at the life cycle cost or the whole cost. So sometimes you can be better off spending more on the specification, on a finish, on floors. Let's just say marble floors will last a lot longer than carpets. But then you've got to think, is it going to go out of fashion? So when I was saying about plan shape, wall-to-floor ratios, there's just an example of two plan shapes, which I'm not sure if you can see all of it, but they're both the same floor area, but one has a much higher perimeter wall and therefore wall area. So building B is a lot more efficient than building A in terms of plan shape. Okay, bang on time, half an hour gone, and we're now going to look at cost management and cost control. So who does cost management and cost control? Normally, it's the quantity surveyor out of the design team, but that's assuming that a quantity surveyor has been appointed. And I'm sure you guys will end up on projects where the client doesn't want to appoint a quantity surveyor, and you end up doing that task yourselves, typically on smaller scale projects and domestic projects. What I would suggest, if you're put in that position, really you ought to charge a higher fee, or you ought to charge a fee for that other element of work. I think the other important thing is that cost management and cost control should be proactive, not reactive. So you're trying to forecast all the time, you're trying to look ahead, trying to spot problems so you can deal with them, not deal with them when they arise. So you should be proactive, not reactive. So cost reporting is merely being reactive. Cost controlling is being proactive because you're trying to control. Reporting is just telling somebody after the event. So the multi-party collaborative approach, that's really saying it's, whilst the quantity surveyor takes the lead, everybody in the team has a responsibility to cost. So you as architects, every line you put on a drawing somewhere has a cost somehow. So you shouldn't be putting lines on drawings without informing the whole party, the whole team, because there may be a cost implication. Okay? So why do we do cost control? It's really to make sure employers are provided with value for money. And value for money is the best quality and design for the price to be paid. Okay? Best quality and design for the price to be paid. That's value for money. A bit like when you go shopping. You go shopping for clothes or food or whatever you go shopping for, you're looking for value for money, aren't you? Why should I pay that for that just because it's got a badge on? I can get this one instead. Or you may be the other way around. You may be very design conscious and you want that jumper with the badge on, and you'll give up on something else instead. Okay, so value for money, again, we all do it, and we should do it in our jobs as well. We should be looking for value for money. It should make employers and designers aware of the cost conscious of their desires and proposals. I think that's quite key, isn't it? You can see where all the costs are. Advice to designers to enable them to arrive at a practical and balanced design. So I'd underline balanced design there, that are within cost limits. Because balance, what it means is making sure you're allocating the cost to the most important parts of the building for the client or the end user. So as an example, in retail, to a retailer, the most important part is the sales area. So the sales area, they'll finish and fit out and make it all jazzy and flashing lights. Back of house in the storeroom would be fairly mundane. And the customer toilets might be better than the staff toilets. The staff toilets will be just very functional. The customer toilets might be a little bit more jazzy. And so that's trying to get a balanced design. There are some developers who develop offices. And I won't name names, but what they do, their view is that a person decides within the first 2 minutes of whether they're going to rent the office off them. So they spend all the money in the reception areas. They want you to walk in, wow, this is great. And then they spend less money in the actual office itself. And that's their marketing. That's the way they market. Other people are different. Okay, you need to be able to keep expenditure within cost limits or within budget, whichever is approved by the client. And you want to provide robust cost information on which the employer can make informed decisions. And I've got on the end there, cost predictability. That is absolutely vital. Cost predictability. It's key. Because if you deliver a job at the end and you've delivered it below the forecast final cost that you've been reporting all the way through, it could mean you've missed an opportunity for that client to add value. So you get to the end of the job that's had £1 million budget from day number one, and you've been reporting all the way through the job £1 million, and right at the last minute you go to the client and say, I've done a cracking job here, I've got it for 900,000. I've had a situation like that in our office where the client was actually livid. And what he basically said, if I'd known we were going to make such a saving, I'd have done things differently and made different decisions. So cost predictability is really, really important. And that's what the job of cost controlling and cost management is. It's trying to predict, right from day one, what the final cost is, all the way through the process. So how do we do it? How do we do cost management? How do we do cost control? So these that I've listed here are the typical cost management or cost control stages, except value engineering. Value engineering should happen at every stage. Okay, so all the ones apart from value engineering, and they're in the typical order that you do them as well. They're all the stages of cost control. And so what we're going to do in a bit is look through each of those stages individually. But value engineering should happen at every stage. It tends to happen when the job starts to go over budget, but it should be happening at day one. Okay? So when do we do cost management and when do we do cost control? So on the previous slide, I told you estimating, cost planning, cost checking, pre-tender estimates, etc. And within the RIBA plan of work, they are where these cost control tasks take place. So it starts at preparation all the way through to in use. Okay? And estimating and cost planning, that's the first stage we talked about. So estimating and cost planning. So if we move on to that, what is an estimate and what's a cost plan? So they're the definitions that I've put down there. And I think that, again, the important thing, the estimate very often is called an order of cost estimate. That's the terminology that's generally used now. And that's the new rules of measurement published by the RICS. They have order of cost estimate, and then cost plan 1, cost plan 2, cost plan 3. And as you probably guessed, cost plan 1 is the first one you do, cost plan 2 is the second one you do, and they should be getting more and more detail as you go through. I think the difference between an estimate and cost plan that you ought to be aware of is with a cost plan, the whole team has to take ownership of it. The whole team are buying into that cost plan. So if you get a cost plan put in front of you as an architect, you need to read it and check what's been included. Is that what you've designed? Is that what your client is anticipating? Because if it isn't, you need to shout up then. Because once you sign up to that cost plan, and I say sign up in inverted commas, once you've gone ahead with that cost plan, you're basically accepting it. And that's what you're all buying into. I suppose ultimately it's the quantity surveyor's responsibility to get those costs right, but in terms of what's in there, everyone's buying into it. So when do we do estimating and cost planning? Well, we do the order of cost estimate, normally at preparation stage, and then the formal cost plans between stages 2 and 4. Okay, so that's why I've bolded those two elements of it. How do we do it? So estimates, normally you're doing estimates with very little information. So it's because it's normally at the briefing stage or preparation stage. So very often it's on a floor area method. So you measure the area of the floor, or the client tells you how much floor area he needs. I need 10,000 square metres of office space. He might tell you where it is, and it's a bit like that one over there. And you do your estimate based on historic data. So 10,000 square metres times £1,600 a square metre, that's your budget estimate. That's all you've got at that stage. You may do it on a functional unit method. So like we talked before about government departments, cost per bed space, cost per student, or cost per car park space. We're going to build a multi-storey car park, and the multi-storey car park's 1,000 spaces. 1,000 spaces times, say, £10,000 a space. That's your budget estimate. Or you may do the estimate on elemental method. So that's where you go through all the elements. So you try and measure out. This is assuming you had enough information. It's not worth doing it if there's no information there. You measure out the foundations, the frame, the upper floor, the roof, the internal walls, internal doors, floor walls, ceiling finishes, services, etc., etc. So that's how you do it. When you do a cost plan, you do it. Sorry, going back onto the estimates, I did say about that there's lots of data around to get some of these cost per square metre rates. Building cost information service is one. In-house data you might have in your own office, or Spond's architectural building price book. There's Wessex, there's Laxton's. There's lots of building price books that have data in where you can get this data. In terms of the cost plan, that will always be done on an elemental type of method of estimating. So as I said, substructure, frame, upper floors, roof, etc. You measure in as much detail as you possibly can and try and apply those rates to what you've measured. So in terms of estimating and cost planning, what are the other considerations? So we've already talked about shape, story height, location, contingency and risk, and inclusions and exclusions. Very, very important that you consider contingency and risk. Very often at an early stage you might just put a percentage on, but really what you should be doing is using a risk register, identifying the risks and then trying to manage them, analysing them and then trying to manage them like we talked about earlier. And inclusions and exclusions, make sure it's very clear whether professional fees are included, so the architect's fees and the structural engineer's fees, etc. Make sure it's clear whether VAT's included, VAT, value-added tax. What about land acquisition costs, financing costs, all those things? Very important to be very specific that these items are included or they're excluded. We've been involved in a number of court cases where builders are giving domestic clients prices, and if you give a domestic client a price, it's deemed to include VAT. So it's really the best way of doing it is saying my price is this plus VAT or including VAT. Okay. So here's a typical example of an order of cost estimate, which is based on sketch plans and elevations. So you can see on here that the contents page, there's an overall summary, there's a building works summary, and there's a basis of the estimate, and there's a breakdown of how we've arrived at that estimate. This was done on an elemental basis, and then we also have a risk, but we had the easy cop-out on it. So the following pages, that's like an overall summary of the estimate for this particular job, and I can't even read what it says on there. It's quite a small scale project, this. I think it's 500,000 kind of price. So the building works estimate summary is broken down into the classroom extension on this particular job, works for the existing building and site works. So that's the total estimate of the building work estimate that gets transferred to here. Okay. Then from that we add on, if we need to, main contractors, overheads and profit, preliminaries I should say, then overheads and profit. And then we add on design fees and contingency. And in this case, contingency we just did as a percentage. That's the easy way out. Probably we shouldn't have done that. So we have a basis of estimate. So we make it clear that VAT is excluded, land acquisition costs are excluded, employer finance costs. But in this case, fees are included because they're on the front page. We tell them the basis of the estimate. So we've done it on these drawings that we've been given. We're telling them it should be used for initial feasibility purposes at the moment. So in terms of the 3 classroom extension, these are the elements: substructure, that's the elemental cost of the substructure, frame, upper floors, roof, etc. All the way down, and we get a total cost of whatever that is, and that gets transferred to the summary. So that's just an indication of what a cost plan or an estimate might look like. The front sheet on that particular document could have actually read cost plan, because a cost plan would look like that. The estimate could have been just a one-page, X square metres times X pounds a square metre. When we're doing cost management and cost control, the next stage is a tender analysis. So this is assuming we've gone out to tender, then we're analysing what that tender is. So we're checking the tender prices that have been submitted. So why do we do that? We're looking for any obvious errors in the pricing, arithmetical errors, or we're looking for loading of price. So have they put all of the substructure works early on, and all the painting and decorating that you do last is very, very cheap. And if you're getting that, you need to identify that, because it could cause you problems if that contractor has become insolvent, because you'd have paid for a lot of the works up front, and yet all the work that still needs to be complete, you're not going to have enough money to go and get another contractor to finish it. So you're looking for loading of price, or consistency and competitiveness of pricing. So pricing consistency should help you identify if anything's been loaded. So the prices that you've got, are they consistent with what you'd expect? And do they look competitive? And then also, how do you deal with any errors that you find? So there are some procedures, codes of procedure that you can follow that are published by various bodies. The old one everyone talks about is the NJCC code of procedure. That's been totally superseded, and we're now on practice notes, JCT practice notes, which tell you how how many tenders you should go to, the kind of letters you should send out, how you should analyse the tenders, how you should notify results, how you should award tenders. All those kind of things are in there. So when are you going to be doing that? Tender analysis will always be done after you've got your tender back and before construction starts. So it could be, it depends on the way that you're procuring the work, but it'll definitely be before construction, because you need to analyse that tender before you start construction. It could be anywhere there, depending, if you're going design and build, it might be earlier, it might be later, after all the technical design is done. So how do you do a tender analysis? Well, the normal thing you do is compare it to your pre-tender estimate or your last cost plan or your last estimate, and see if there are any differences. And if there are any differences, highlight them and ask the questions why. Why is that different? And you can ask that of the contractor. I've noticed this rate. Can you please explain, how you've arrived at that rate or that price? And then you would do a tender report. So a tender report to your client. We've been out to tender. These are the tender prices we have. This is the lowest tender price received. We've analysed it. Is it competitive? Is it arithmetically correct? Is it competitively priced? What's your recommendation? Okay, so you go through all that in a tender report. The next stage is construction stage cost control. So what's that? So we're forecasting the anticipated final cost at regular intervals, normally monthly. So again, we're doing cost predictability. We're trying to predict what is the end cost of this project. We need to account for variations. So if there are any changes or variations that have occurred, we should be reporting on those and the costs of them. So variations we know about that might happen as well, you could be reporting on those. And as I say, we should be trying to control and be proactive and not just merely reporting, being reactive. In terms of variations, what are variations? We get variations because there's additional work. We've decided we're going to add on to this project, we're going to add a conservatory to this house. Or we might omit work. We can't afford everything, so we're going to omit this element of the work. It might be changes in specification. We've decided to spend more money in one area than the other. So the client's changed his mind. It might be correction of something that's wrong on your drawing or wrong in the bills of quants or the employer's requirements or the tender documents. So it might be correcting errors. In terms of why do we do construction stage cost control, it's to keep abreast of those variations so everyone knows, so the client's updated on the anticipated predictability, predictive cost, what's it going to cost at the end. And it helps them to assist in decision making. So if they can see, as an example, if you're reporting properly and controlling properly, they can see the predictive cost at the end and they can make their own minds up. Do I want to spend a little bit more because I'm going to achieve this within my budget? Or do I now need to cut back because it's going over my budget, it's going over my cost limit? So it helps clients with decision making. And as I said, variations, they occur because of change of mind, errors. Fashion might mean a variation. So you do get some retailers who suddenly realise that they're making a lot more money in, say, the food hall rather than the clothing section, so they'll spend more money in there. So that might be a variation. Make the food hall bigger, therefore we need more chillers, more food hall space. We're going to make other departments smaller. That could be a fashion thing, or technology, or business trends. Actually, business trends and fashion could, yeah, anyway. So there's lots of reasons for variations. When do we do construction stage cost control? Well, we do it via cost control reports during the construction stage, during stage 5. And how do we do it? We do it with cost control reports, and those cost control reports need to be regular reports, normally monthly. We've been involved in some fast-track projects where they're weekly and even fortnightly. But basically, the norm is a monthly cost control report. The norm is a monthly valuation where you value the works and make a payment. That's the norm. So what we tend to do is after every valuation, we make a cost report. And here's a typical cost report. This is for a house. It's quite an old one, and I've had to choose old projects because of confidentiality. There you go. You have analysis of the current position, which is like an executive summary. So many clients will just read this front page here, or this first page. If it's where they expect it to be, they probably won't read anymore. But then we get into the summary of the financial position. And then there's backup to each of those things. So adjustment of architect's instructions, there'll be a backup to how those costs are calculated. There'll be a backup to adjustment of provisional sums and a backup to contingency, etc. So these are the backup items going through all of those costs. So that cost there, 11,333. You can see that's a client approved adjustment, because what we're saying is he's reduced his budget because he's omitted something. So that's his new budget, and that's what we're trying to report against. At the moment, we're showing an underspend of a couple of £1,000 on that project. So that client at the time is pretty happy. And then we go to architect's instructions, which are all listed out. And we get to, so the summary of, obviously I've only copied certain pages, but the summary of all those instructions will then go to the summary sheet. And adjustment of prime cost sums, which there weren't any on this job, and adjustment of provisional sums, etc. So it's quite a detailed document which you need to do on a monthly basis, or the quantity surveyor should do on a monthly basis. And the other one that's important as well is known variations or known changes that have not yet been confirmed. So that's also an aide-memoire for you guys as architects. I need to do an architect's instruction here to get these confirmed. So on this particular job, we had quite a lot of them going on at the time. And then if we think there might be any claims, contract claims, which I think you've had a lecture on, you should be reporting it, even if you've not received it yet. So in this particular case, no claim for loss and expense have been received at the date of the report, but we think there is going to be one, and we think you should allow that kind of money. Because what we're trying to do is predict to the client, that's your end cost. And contingency, showing how that's been adjusted, or whether it has been adjusted. So that's a typical example of a cost report. And then the final little bit is final account in terms of cost management and cost control. So the final account is the final cost of the job to the contractor, having regard to, there's the original contract sum, a bit like the cost report. The final account ought to be a replication of the cost report with the final bits added in, and the final account was wherever it's agreed at. So it accounts for all the variations, the provisional sums, the prime cost sums, and any loss and expense. And after you've done your cost control management on the final account, it's good practice to have a feedback meeting with the client and the design team to see what went well, to see what didn't go very well, how does that final cost compare to the very first cost estimate you did? How does it was the predictability that you were trying to achieve all the way through, did it work? If it didn't, why didn't it work? Are there any lessons you can learn? Is there any continuous improvement, adding to the continuous improvement? And the feedback helps to provide information for your next estimate on a similar job. And you might even do a value analysis on the job. Did we deliver value for that client? If not, why not? If we did, how do we do it? How can we repeat that on future jobs? And then the final little bit I wanted to talk about was value engineering. And I did say value engineering is something that should be done at all stages of a project, not just when you find that you're going over budget or beyond your cost limit. So that's why I put there cost limit being exceeded, but it's better to prevent that happening than to cure it when it has happened. So you should be trying to get the best value all the time by value engineering. So what happens if your project, if the cost limit is being exceeded? There are options, aren't there? A bit like your night out. What happens if your money that you've got in your pocket is being exceeded? You can ring up Bank of Mum and Dad and see if they can loan you, or your friends, see if they can give you a bit more money, so get additional funding, or you can reject. So you've got to say, I haven't got the extra money, so therefore I've got to identify and implement some savings. So I'm not going to have a kebab or I'm going to walk home. Okay. So again, with construction, it's the same kind of thing. So you need to implement savings. So what you might do is decide that a particular element of the cost plan or a particular element of the works, that's where you're going to implement the saving. You're not going to spend as much, say, on the finishings or on the floor finishings. You're going to reduce the quality, or you're going to reduce the scope of it. Other remaining elements, you may do the same, or you may defer certain work. So you might build your master plan and say, but that garage that we were going to build at the back, I'm going to defer that until another date. I've got space for it, but I can't afford it at the moment. What you're trying to do, value engineering, is engineering the design and the quality to get value for money. So you're trying to get the best quality and design for the price to be paid, which I said earlier. So value engineering is trying to get the best quality and design for the price that you're going to pay for it. So what the aim is of value engineering is to deliver better value items of clients' objectives. So you're trying to get more for less, or you're trying to get more for the same, or the same for less. So it's more for less, more for the same, or the same for less. And how do you do that with value engineering workshops? So I think there I'm saying they must be multidisciplinary. You can't have a workshop on your own, because you'll identify the things that you want to identify and perhaps not be aware of the consequences of it. So you need multidisciplinary. You need your engineer there, you need your quant surveyor there, your architect obviously, services engineer, structural engineer, because something that you're proposing might have other implications. You need everybody to buy into it and put their expertise in. You may want what I call, inverted commas, outsiders involved. It's becoming a lot more common now. I was at a meeting this morning where the compliance team member of a client turned up at a site meeting, and the compliance team, what they do, they're checking for compliance with specification, but also they're looking for future maintenance problems that they may have and trying to input into that. Now, to be honest, it's a little bit late for them to have turned up at a site meeting. They should have been at the design meetings. But nevertheless, the earlier you get people involved, the better. So you might want, the outsider might be the maintenance department, who can come in and say, the biggest problem we have on this campus and this university is blocked drains. What we need to make sure we do is X, Y, Z on the drains. Okay, so we've got good access to them, we can maintain them easily, so we don't disrupt lectures and everything else. So those outsiders, end users are probably the best outsiders to have, because they're using the building. So, in schools, it's good to ask the pupils or the teachers, what are you looking for in your school? What will add value to this building if we're designing it. So it's also important that it's properly facilitated. And what that means really is you want to create an atmosphere for creativity, for good thinking. You don't want people to be afraid of giving their opinions within a meeting. So it needs to be very, very open, encouraging and motivating kind of atmosphere. But at the same time, you do need a disciplined structure. So you need somebody to chair it and to kind of go through an agenda, making sure that we don't go too far off on tangents. You shouldn't pursue changes which detract from the project's required or basis functions. So what that's trying to say, basis functions, let's take a hotel as an example. It's no good looking at a hotel design saying we've got to get value for money, and then say what we're going to do, we're going to omit all the ensuite showers in the hotel rooms, because that's cost cutting. It should be how can we have all these ensuite showers? How can we do it differently that's going to provide better value? So one way, and everyone does it now, is back-to-back ensuites. So you've got one set of drainage, or you can even have all the ensuites in a cluster of 4 almost, so that each room has their own private ensuite, but they're all located in the same location. So the services distribution becomes a lot more cost-effective. So it's what you're really trying to do on a basis function. You're trying to say, how do we achieve the same function in a different way? So we still want ensuite rooms. How do we achieve it in a different way that's more cost effective? Okay, and in terms of a value engineering workshop, this is the last slide, you'd be pleased to know. There's lots of phases that you need to go through. So this is a typical structure of a value engineering workshop. So the information phase, what you really need to do there is details of all the problems of the projects are presented, and what you need to do is get your objectives, distinguish between needs and wants. What's needed, what's wanted. So cost and worth. What's it costing? Is it worth having? So worth is the least cost to provide the particular function. So if you took as an example a window, the basic function of a window is to control ventilation, it's to exclude moisture, retain heat, and to transmit light. So the most basic window is, let's just say it's a softwood frame with a piece of glass in it. Okay? So what you could say is, well, should we have a hardwood frame? Because that'll extend its life. Well, what's that going to cost? Is it worth doing? You may say, well, should we have double glazing because that'll improve the heat retention and lower our bills. What's it going to cost? Is it worth doing? Should we put some glazing bars in to make it look a bit nicer? What's it going to cost? Is it worth doing? Okay, so that's why you do a function analysis. You then move on to the creative phase, which is really to try and generate alternative solutions and ideas. So that's where you're trying to make, you're trying to make people free to even what might seem a really stupid idea might be a really good idea. So you don't want to try and restrict anybody from saying something. So you've got to generate as many ideas as you can and encourage those ideas, no matter how daft they may seem. Then you need to evaluate them. So you select the ideas for further development, those that you think might be beneficial, those that you think might produce a good saving, better value. And you need to select a team to actually champion that and progress it and look at it in more detail. So that's somebody who accepts the responsibility. The champion, someone who accepts the responsibility for that particular element that you're going to look at, or that idea, and take it forward. And the development phase is where those teams, led by that champion, do the further work to see if the ideas generated in the creative, selected in the creative phase, to see if they can become firm proposals. Because it might be you go away, you look into it in more detail, think actually no, we can't do that. But it might be, yeah, we can do it, work on it more and come back. Then present it, you come back and present it, present your proposals with a plan of action to try and change what's been designed and try and get better value. So as I say, I think value engineering should start right at the beginning. Because as an example, if you've already designed a building and value engineering hasn't been happening and you're not getting best value, and you've gone in for planning, you've got your planning permission, you've then gone to tender and you've got a tender price, and all your drawings have been detailed and developed, and suddenly you find out it's unaffordable and we've got to cut the costs and value engineer. Cost cutting and value engineering are different things, but you need to lower the cost and value engineer, well, you're going to be undoing a lot of work you've already done. So you've already wasted a lot of money. You're then going to have to go back to planning possibly for some of the ideas that may have been developed that are going to produce a better value. So you should be doing it as early as you can. Okay, so that concludes what I need to talk about. So I'm happy to answer any questions if you've got any.